Alright, so for the following sections, we're going to segment some of these into the dichotomy of serotonin transporter blockers, so based on the main mechanism, and those that work without blocking serotonin transporters, which is an easy dichotomy when you consider we only have one non-SERT blocker in the Philippines. So it will better help explain later on how they differ in their clinical properties, side effects, interactions, and so on, based on that, right? But a lot of the focus will actually go to SSRIs. They have the widest scope of indications. They are the most commonly used in primary and secondary care here in the Philippines, and they have the superior safety profile in general. Right, and so speaking of indications, when we look at the indications here, that's a lot of them. This really goes back to why the title of this is so-called antidepressants, borrowing from how the 5th edition of Stahl's Essential Psychopharmacology entitled that chapter of their book, because, like with antihypertensives, losartan, they're not just for hypertension. You'll see them for heart failure. You will see candesartan used for migraine prophylaxis, right? So, likewise, antidepressants, they are simply named chronologically based on what they were first discovered for. But as you will see, they have many uses, both mental and physical. And one mnemonic memory aid I use is antidepressants. Well, I use the class name mismo. So, depressants. So, that would be the depressive disorders. AS, eating disorders. So, there are 4 eating disorders. You have ARFID, anorexia, binge eating, and bulimia. And the textbook we use they don't mention binge eating, which is kind of sad because binge eating is the most common eating disorder actually, and we do use SSRIs for that, binge eating and bulimia. Unfortunately, for anorexia, no pharmacologic agent has proven efficacious compared to placebo on any of the outcomes we study. So mostly it's psychological interventions and nutritional therapy for anorexia. But for these two, we can use SSRIs. Now, that's for ES, and then AN, anxiety and related disorders. Because for anxiety disorders, we have panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and social anxiety disorder. Those are the 3 we can use SSRIs for. But you notice I separate PTSD and OCD. So PTSD, that's where the TS comes in, traumatic stress, because PTSD is a trauma and stress related disorder. And OCD, technically, that's an impulse control related disorder. I run out of letters for that, unfortunately. I have to think of something new for that, no? And body dysmorphic disorder also. Yan. So, you can use a specific SSRI for that. Fluoxetine specifically. And, about physical alternatives, ang SSRIs for the vasomotor symptoms of menopause. So, of course, first line would still be hormonal contraceptives, but we have an alternative, which is SSRIs if hindi matolerate yung first line. So, again, to highlight na hindi lang depression. So, you might think na, kapag anxiety disorders, hindi ba dapat anxiolytics? Well, SSRIs work as anxiolytics as well, albeit they take a while to work, but they are still first line because they are still safer talaga. So much safer. For SNRIs naman, medyo iba. You notice wala yung E dito. They're not as used in eating disorders. But there's an added specific indication here, neuropathic pain. So this is mainly because, again, of the norepinephrine reuptake blockade. So they can increase norepinephrine in the synaptic cleft, which is again involved in the neurotransmission in pain, the spinal cord particularly. That's why sila yung ginagamit for neuropathic pain like migraine prophylaxis, fibromyalgia, and diabetic neuropathy. Yan. And then multimodal, we only have one naman. And because it's relatively new, innovator only, we haven't studied it as much. So we only have assurance that it works for depression. It could work theoretically for other conditions, but since we don't have clinical trials to support that, we're just gonna say for depression na lang muna. Plus, medyo pricey siya compared to the others. So, alam nyo na, my bias against pricey things. Now, this software is going to really, really help drive this point home. There's a very common misconception that antidepressants take 4 to 6 weeks to work for depression, which is, I have to say as early as now, false. Completely false, wrong, erroneous, almost as bad as a chemical imbalance one. Even actually the books we use are kind of clear on this, although I guess they should be clearer since people are still taking home the wrong message. I'm going to illustrate this with this graph here from a clinical trial on agomelatine versus placebo for depression from Kennedy 2005. If you look here, the x-axis shows time. So y-axis is response based on depression rating scale scores. Yan. So this is basically response over time. Okay. So you have the solid line, agomelatine, the dashed line, placebo. So the lower the score, the better. Less depression, supposedly. So you see in week 0, they start at the same place, obviously, at baseline. And week 1, you'll notice they haven't really separated much. They're pretty much more or less the same for all intents and purposes. But one thing you will notice at week 1, I have to move this way, is at week 1, while they are pretty much the same, they are both decreasing. They are both decreasing. Yes, the decrease in depression scores of agomelatine is similar to placebo, but they are still both decreasing. At week 2, that is when you see agomelatine finally separates statistically from placebo. This is where the P is less than 0.00, so on. So statistically significant separation from placebo on efficacy, and oftentimes the effect sizes will be more or less the same with, say, antihypertensives or pain meds. Ganon. So yeah, at week 2, there is already separation from placebo. But that doesn't mean there are no improvements in week 1. It's just that in week 1, it's pretty much a placebo level response. But in week 2, it's already more than placebo. So generally for depression, we say 1 to 2 weeks. Okay. Well, of course, you might wait a bit longer for late responders or adjustment of doses. But in general, onset should happen within 2 weeks. And if not, you would tell a person to go back to their doctor to start adjusting things like dose, etc., etc. Okay? But this is for depression. For some reason, it takes a bit longer for anxiety and related disorders to kick in, for the onset to kick in. This is usually when you would need a bridging drug like a benzo for short term before the SSRIs kick in. Not really sure why. Maybe because the receptors need to downregulate a bit more for anxiety disorders. Not really sure. But anyway, just take note of the difference in onset of action. Now, how do you take these? Generally, once daily. Some will advise fluoxetine dose can be divided, but generally speaking, it's once daily. If you look at memes and other references, they'll say you can take this with or without food. But generally, I would advise to take it with food. Why? You can't really predict how people respond to serotonergic medications. For some people, like me, I took an SSRI before, not like really much happened on the GI side. But for some people, their tummies can be really sensitive, and we can't predict. You can't judge it based on physical appearance or lab tests or what. Some people are just sensitive like that. So, personally, I just say, you know what? Take it with food. Take it with meals. Number 1 benefit is you get to improve adherence by locking in the antidepressant to a meal regimen, which can help with adherence. And the second thing is you can preemptively prevent any GI-related side effects, or at least reduce their intensity kahit papaano. Right? Now, while we're on the topic of SERT blockers, I'd like to draw your attention here. One particular contraindication for 2 specific SERT blockers, namely fluoxetine and paroxetine, and that being co-administration with tamoxifen. So what's up with tamoxifen? So tamoxifen, we know that's a drug on the Philippine Breast Cancer Medicine Access Program, obviously used for breast cancer. And so what's up with tamoxifen? What does it have to do with SSRIs? Tamoxifen, well, it works on its own. It's an active, sure. But in order to be more active, it needs to be converted by CYP enzymes, notably CYP2D6 among them, to an active metabolite for hydroxytamoxifen, or, some references will call it endoxifen, yeah? So the metabolite is more active, generally, than the parent compound. Now, what happens when you take 2 particular SSRIs, so fluoxetine and paroxetine, and you kind of just Wait, my hand's going through. I need to lift my body up a bit. All right. What happens when you just stop? Because these two are potent 2D6 inhibitors. Fluoxetine blocks a lot of CYP enzymes, but 2D6 is one of them. Paroxetine only blocks 2D6, but it does so potently. So what happens when you take a drug that inhibits cytochrome 450 2D6 enzyme? So, wala na yan. 2D6. Harang. What will happen to the amount of active metabolite? Will it increase or decrease? What will happen to the amount of parent compound, tamoxifen? Will it increase, decrease? If you block the activity of 2D6, there will be less enzyme to metabolize tamoxifen to the active metabolite. So there will be less active metabolite, endoxifen, and more of it will be in the less active form, tamoxifen. And what happens there? Best case scenario, the epidemiologic studies, admittedly, they're conflicting. Some say generally this interaction has no clinical significance. But at worst, the problem is at worst, paroxetine has been implicated to cause an additional 1 out of 20 deaths in women with breast cancer. This interaction can screw with the efficacy of tamoxifen to the point that it can cause an additional 1 in 20 deaths. Right? So that's the worst case scenario. So, given that there are other SSRIs, right, that do not interfere with 2D6 activity, why not just stick to those instead of choosing these two, right? So, of course, in these scenarios, tamoxifen would be the priority if it's working, so better just choose a different SSRI na lang.